we've covered on a previous episode that trying to look through the live view monitor really makes it difficult to do things like focus and exposure. It's not ergonomic, it's not in a good place.
Yep.
Plus, a lot of times when we're on set, we actually need to collaborate with other people, share the video signal.
That's right. I mean, we've talked about this before, but everything looks good on the back of a 3-inch monitor. So oftentimes you want to pipe out of the camera to, something simple, maybe like an EVF, like an electronic viewfinder like this, maybe a larger monitor like this, or maybe you want to go even bigger. Sometimes on set you might have something like, a plasma or a big LCD way back off set where clients can be comfortable and they can sit and watch what's going on. But to do that, Rich, we need to be able to most likely adapt the signal in some shape or fashion, right?
Yeah, I think the first thing you're gonna have to decide is what type of video signal can I get out of my camera?
Right.
Now, most DSLRs are going to have either an HDMI or a mini HDMI coming out of the camera body itself.
That's right.
So we've seen these before, but there's different types of cables. In this case, I have a mini HDMI to full-size HDMI, and I got a specialty cable here that's designed to bend, which is good because if your cables don't bend, your gear tends to fall over or ports tend to break.
That's very true.
What happens if you break a port on a camera, Rob?
You got to send it back into the manufacturer. You'll be without your camera for a while, and
Out a couple $100 at least.
Out a couple $100, and you'll be very unhappy. So yeah, this little swivel one is a nice one. But you made an interesting point. Is that most of the time on these cameras, generally speaking, they're going to be mini HDMI, and mini HDMI is not something that you find very often outside of the production market. Sure, maybe some home theater receivers and stuff like that have it, but you need to go out and find specialty mini HDMI to HDMI cables. Now, if you don't have a mini HDMI cable, this is a little guy that comes in very handy. Now, when you're going out to buy one of these guys, this is a full-size HDMI on one side to mini HDMI on the other side. Buy a bunch of these. These things are very small and they tend to go missing very quickly. So I usually buy them in gross. Buy a dozen or 2 dozen or so at a time.
I was going to say packs of 5, but since I used to have 5 and that's the only one I could find in my bag, it's time to buy a gross.
Right, so this is nice because if you don't have the specialty cable, you can simply plug in the mini HDMI end and then a full-size HDMI cable to the other side, run it out to your monitoring and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and what's going to be helpful here is that you're going to need to adapt. So you mentioned earlier the electronic viewfinder.
Yep.
I'm a big fan of using the EVF. What I have here, though, is the ability to go in. So I can take a full-size HDMI in and then loop it back out. So this is a better monitor for me. It's high resolution. I can mount it on the camera. I could put it on an arm. And then I can loop that signal coming out of there. And for that, I've gone ahead and actually have gotten an L bracket to convert it. So instead of the cable sticking out the side here,
or somebody can bump it or get pulled over, right?
I could just go ahead and put that into the output there, and now it runs straight backwards. So you see there, it's coming straight out, and now the cable can run away from the camera as opposed to hanging out the side. It makes it easier to drape on down. Now, once I have that HDMI looping out, I've gone from my monitoring to sharing with others. What can I do with that full HDMI out?
Well, you could do a lot of things with it. I mean, you could go into a full-size monitor, you could go into a recorder, that kind of thing. But here's the one problem with HDMI, Rich, is that it doesn't run very long distances. So it's great when you're sort of, in a self-contained kind of setup right on set, but let's say your monitoring is 40, 50 feet away, or you're trying to do other long cable lengths. HDMI is not going to be the thing for you. Professional videographers and professional video post people have come to know and love SDI video over the years, serial digital interface. And the beauty about SDI is that it carries an uncompressed signal like HDMI, but it can run for very, very long lengths. So the other type of adaptation that we often have to make in the field when working with HDMI equipped cameras is that we sometimes need to go HDMI to SDI, or even maybe go analog. We could go SDI to, say, component analog. And fortunately, there's a lot of different ways that we can adapt that. But one of the things that I'm a really big fan of, Rich, is this guy right here. Now, this one is made by AJA, but Blackmagic and others make these. And what this allows you to do is plug in an HDMI signal on this end, and then on the other side, you actually have 2 SDI outputs. So if you need to do a really long cable run from HDMI from your camera to, say, a monitor that's further away or a recorder that's further away, these are a good investment to make.
Now, before I get to that, I do want to say, even though HDMI cables shouldn't be run too far, this little guy is going to save you. What you see here is I can go from HDMI to HDMI, and this is essentially a coupler that lets you plug two HDMI cables together. So maybe I'm going out the camera. Well, I don't want to have this box dangling right by the camera body. So by using an adapter here, I can go from the camera cable to a full-length HDMI cable and then run this on out, and that's going to give me a little more reach.
Absolutely, but you can also use multiple adapters if you need to. Now, I come from the attitude of less adapters, the fewer problems that you're probably going to have. But in this case, Rich, you have this adapter right here in place. I can simply plug this guy in right here, plug my BNC over here on this end, so I have an SDI signal, and now I have a nice signal path going out to all the monitors.
Look, it's cable soup. Yes.
Yeah.
You have to always be careful with cables that you take the time to lay them down. Actually, this is a good time to mention, though, because monitoring is critical, what don't I want to do with these cables and, say, any power cables on set?
Yeah, it's always a bad idea to sort of run your power cables and video or audio cables, for that matter, in parallel to each other. When you do that or you overlap them, oftentimes you can get interference. Now, good cables are often very well shielded, so it's not nearly as problematic as it has been in the past with analog video and analog audio signals, but just, be careful of that. You never want to sort of have a whole bird's nest of cables overlapping each other. Now, Rich, there is one more adapter or two more adapters that I want to mention that really come in handy and I think are essential pieces to your kit. Now, this little guy looks like a little T, right? Now, you might think to yourself, well, what's the big deal with this? Well, oftentimes you'll need to be able to feed signal to multiple places at the same time. So you might want to be able to feed a signal, say an SDI signal, to one client monitor over here, and maybe the production team over here has another one. This little guy allows you to do that. It has an input coming from, say, your HDMI to SDI converter, and then you can run two signals off of it so you can split the signal, which is really nice. And then the other one I think that's an essential piece of kit to have are little barrel adapters like this. Now this one allows me to go BNC or an SDI signal to RCA. So you might have an adapter that goes HDMI out to component analog. Well, what if your monitor only has sort of consumer RCA inputs? You'd need something like this.
Yeah, and so to sort of break this down for you as you're trying to decide what to pull off, I want you to realize that this is really a spectrum.
Yeah.
For example, most folks will get by just fine with a good HDMI monitor. If it's just you shooting, I can't recommend enough. Go for something like an electronic viewfinder so you have a higher resolution signal. Then, if you need to collaborate with others, you could take that HDMI signal out into another HDMI type monitor. This could be a small portable one that runs off of batteries for field use, or even a consumer grade television. Just the larger screen will go a long way. Now, the type of stuff we're talking about with HDMI to HD SDI, this is really when you're going on a professional video set. And if you're on that set, HD SDI is just the standard that everything gets used for the monitors. So those adapters come into play. Remember, you're all at different points in a production. Some of you are just running and gunning one-man bands. On the other hand, just last week, I was on a pro video set and we were using two DSLRs, but we absolutely needed that critical monitoring. And the one advantage of HD SDI is that you start to get to be able to take advantage of higher quality monitors with things like built-in scopes as well.
Absolutely. And I think, Rich, just like adapting audio, it's essential that you be prepared. You might not need to use all these adapters and different cables on every single production, but it's nice to have that in your kit. So when the situation arises where you need to adapt the video, you're prepared instead of saying, hey, PA, run down to Radio Shack or something of that nature, So it's always better to be prepared.
My 7-Eleven carries HDMI.
Oh, of course. Always better to be prepared and be ready for those situations when you need to adapt the video or audio signal.
All right, so when we come back, we're going to tackle two last things. That is options for connecting equipment, as well as some alternatives for power.